major political changes in Russia happen like this, at the snap of a finger, suddenly, swiftly, unexpectedly. Both the Tsarist regime at the beginning of the 20th century and the communist regime at the end of the 20th century went down in 3 days, literally speaking, and nobody was prepared. And that's why so many mistakes were made. We cannot afford to repeat those mistakes. And so the next time there is a window of opportunity for democratic change that opens in Russia, we have to be ready to seize it. And because we know that the future belongs to democracies. The future does not belong to corrupt dictatorial regimes such as the regime of Vladimir Putin. And nobody has ever been able to stop the course of history, and Putin won't be able to either.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau, on the occasion of and at the venue of the 10th Magnitsky Awards in London. And today we're meeting two people, both fierce critics of the Kremlin, both staunch supporters of democracy and human rights, and both who pursue sanctions against corrupt individuals linked to the Kremlin. One of them, Bill Browder, you'll know well for his many appearances here on Frontline. But the other, I never thought I'd actually get to meet you in person. Vladimir Kara-Murza, political activist who was released from prison in Russia in a prisoner swap in August. He'd been serving 25 years for high treason for criticising the war in Ukraine. Vladimir, it's so good to see you in person.
It's wonderful to be here on your program, and I really mean it when I say it.
Now, you and Bill have followed events in the Kremlin for some time. Trump is now coming back to the White House. The war in Ukraine is closing in on its third year, and you've always been a fierce critic of Vladimir Putin. Where do you see his position right now?
Well, let's not forget that in a very important sense, Vladimir Putin has failed in his main objectives in Ukraine, because his aims in February of 2022 were to take Kiev in 5 days, as we all remember well, and secondly, to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign and independent country. Well, neither of these goals very obviously has been realized. And in fact, instead of that, now for the first time since the Second World War, there are foreign troops on actual legally recognized, internationally recognized Russian territory, which is much more than a slap in the face. It's a public humiliation for any dictator. And so I think that's what's important to keep in mind. As much as the Putin propaganda machine will try to portray whatever outcome of this war in a settlement that lots of people are talking about for next year, however the Putin propaganda will try to portray this, I think it's very important for people not to lose sight of reality.
And I should have asked you right at the start, but how are you? How are you physically? Because you've been through a heck of a lot. You've been poisoned twice. You were in a terrible way when you were in prison. How are you?
Well, I'm still feeling completely surreal, to be honest with you. For the past 3.5 months, it's been as if I've been watching some kind of a film. And it's a very good film, but it still does not feel that it's happening in reality. I was convinced that I was going to die in that Siberian prison. And the prisoner exchange that took place on the 1st of August was nothing less than a miracle. This is how I view it. But it was in so many ways a human-made miracle, because it was made possible by so many good people in democratic nations, and one of them is sitting to my right now, who never stop advocating, speaking, shouting about all those people who are locked up in prisons in Putin's Russia because they have stood up to oppose this criminal regime and its war of aggression in Ukraine. And the media has described this prisoner swap as historic because it was the largest east-west prisoner exchange since the Cold War, and that's certainly true. But what makes it really historic, in my view, is that this was the first exchange of this kind in nearly 4 decades that freed not just Western citizens, Western hostages held in Russian prisons, but actually Russian political prisoners. 8 out of the 16 were Russian political prisoners. And to me, this was the most powerful message sent by the US and German governments with this exchange. Because with this message, they have stated loud and clear that they know that the real criminals are those people who are sitting in the Kremlin and who have started the war in Ukraine, not those of us who are in prison because we had opposed it.
Bill, you and Vladimir are both here for the Magnitsky Awards, as I said, in memory of your lawyer, Sergei. The Magnitsky Act set up the sanctions to pursue corrupt individuals linked to the Kremlin and to get justice for your friend. It has made both of you public enemies of Vladimir Putin and of the Kremlin. What makes it worth it for you?
Well, first of all, I should just say that the reason why the Magnitsky Act exists here in the UK, in the US, and Canada, and the EU, and Australia, is in a large part because of the good efforts that Vladimir put into it. He explained to all the parliaments around the world how important the Magnitsky Act was to Russian citizens who didn't want to be killed, tortured, and have their money stolen by a corrupt regime. And the reason why he got such a harsh sentence, his sentence, 25 years sentence, was the longest sentence of any political prisoner. And the reason why he got such a long sentence was because we worked together on the Magnitsky Act. And Putin hates the Magnitsky Act. He hates me. He hates Vladimir. And he's done all sorts of terrible things to everybody involved. Everybody involved has been, targeted in every possible way. For me, the murder of Sergei Magnitsky was unforgivable. The debt of, or I should say, the guilt that I feel because he was associated with me and he was killed in my service has motivated me to get justice for him, and continued to motivate me to get justice for him, and continued to push me towards getting Magnitsky Acts in all different countries. And Vladimir, as a Russian citizen, a Russian politician, has joined me for his own reasons, because he doesn't want to see his country ruled by these criminals. And we both have worked tirelessly and at great personal risk. And we've seen it, with all of the terrible things they did to Vladimir, how much risk there is in this endeavor.
And of course, Vladimir, Alexei Navalny as well. When you heard about his death in custody, how did you hear and what did you think?
Well, first of all, it wasn't death, it was murder. And it was murder on the personal order of Vladimir Putin. Let's make no mistake about it. Just as Vladimir Putin ordered the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, the opposition leader who was gunned down in front of the Kremlin, literally, in February of 2015. In the same way, he ordered Alexei Navalny to be killed in the Arctic penal colony in February of this year. This was the 16th of February. It was a Friday. Never forget that date. This was towards the evening, because Omsk is quite a few hours ahead of Moscow, so it was really towards the end of the day. I was having my evening meal. And in prison cell, I always had the radio that was switched on. I couldn't have any control of it. I couldn't switch it off. I couldn't turn the volume down. It would come up at 5 o'clock in the morning with a wake-up call, and it will be on all the way until the lights out at 9 p.m. And so I sort of trained myself to ignore that as just some sort of external noise, because obviously this was Russian state radio, so it's not very good for your sanity to try to listen to all this propaganda all the time. So I just learned to sort of don't pay any attention. But suddenly, through this noise, I heard the name of Alexei Navalny, and needless to say, on Russian state media, they don't talk about opposition leaders, opposition politicians. It's as if they do not exist. And this was the first and the last time when I was in prison that I heard Alexei's name. And I jumped up to the wall where that radio was to listen to what they were saying. And the words were completely surreal. It was, something like, he lost consciousness after returning from his walk, and the death occurred at such and such hour. And then that was it. This was the first and last mention. And then they went to some third-rate, unimportant news about whatever. And this was the end of the day. And then came the weekend. And the weekend is the worst time of the week in prison, because there are no letters, there are no lawyers' visits, there's nothing. You just sit in that cell. And I don't think I'll be able to describe the feeling, but because I had already spent by then a long time in solitary confinement, being constantly in solitary confinement, constantly alone, locked in four walls, well, your mind really starts playing tricks at you. I mean, this is why, according to United Nations rules, solitary confinement for more than 15 days is officially equated to torture, because it is in a psychological sense. And so it was completely surreal. And by the end of the weekend, and there was no other mention on the radio or anything, by the end of the weekend, I basically had convinced myself that I just imagined it all, that it wasn't true. But then, of course, came Monday, and my lawyer came to see me on his weekly visit, and he said to me that, unfortunately, I had not imagined it. I just want those people in the West who are calling for some sort of a rapprochement with Vladimir Putin, or some sort of, back to business as usual with Vladimir Putin. Well, in the last 3 months since the exchange, I've been in many countries, meeting with many people, and I do hear these voices. Yeah, they're not dominant by any means, but they're there. And I just hope that these people who are advocating for this type of appeasement, this type of rapprochement with Putin, those people who want to shake Putin's hand again, I hope these people realize that they want to shake hands with a murderer. Because Vladimir Putin is not just, an authoritarian ruler, he's not just a dictator, he's not just a corrupt ruler. He's a murderer in a very literal sense of this word.
And you saying that kind of thing is the kind of thing that does put you in grave danger yourself. And even as you were being released and you were on the tarmac, stepping off the plane in Turkey, who was it that said something to you that was saying, we're watching you and, we might come for you again?
Oh, this was as the plane was landing, just before the exchange took place. One of the FSB convoy officers who were escorting us to Ankara turned to Ilya Yashin, another Russian opposition politician and former political prisoner, and me, and said with a light smile, he said, well, don't you guys think you're going to be safe over there? Krasikov can come for you too. Krasikov being the FSB hitman who was serving time in prison in Germany, who was exchanged for us. Of course, he didn't mean Krasikov literally. There are many of these assassins in the FSB service. I mean, look, we know what it involves, what risks it involves to be in opposition to Vladimir Putin in Russia. We know that Kremlin opponents have been targeted not only on our country's territory, but abroad as well. But, frankly speaking, I try just not to think about it, to be honest with you, because I know that what I'm doing is the right thing and I'm going to continue doing it regardless. But much more importantly than that, even if Vladimir Putin gets rid of all of us, all the people who are sort of the faces, the leaders of the Russian opposition today, well, all this means that others will come and take our place, somebody from the young generation. The future belongs to democracy. Future does not belong to these one-man authoritarian regimes, such as the regime of Vladimir Putin. Russia will be a democracy, whether Vladimir Putin wants it or not. Nobody has ever been able to stop the course of history, and Putin is not going to either.
Bill, I know the awards are happening this evening, so you're going to have to go very shortly. But before I do let you go, I just really wanted to ask you another question. And it's how, you two are planning to build on what you've started with the Magnitsky Act and how you think you can do that in the current climate.
Well, the Magnitsky Act is an incomplete project. There are still countries that haven't got Magnitsky Acts. We have Magnitsky Acts in the United States, Canada, the UK, EU, Australia, and a few other bits and pieces. We don't have it in Japan. We don't have it in New Zealand. Interestingly, one of Vladimir's projects in solitary confinement was to learn a new language.
What did you learn?
I don't know.
Spanish.
Spanish.
I don't know how he did this. Somehow he was able to get a Spanish textbook and taught himself Spanish. And so, we don't have a Magnitsky Act in Chile and in various other Argentina. So there's a possibility of possibly a few Latin American countries with Magnitsky Acts. And then the other thing that we have to do, and this is really important, is that it's only been used sparingly. There are a lot of people who have done a lot of things who should be subject to Magnitsky sanctions. And part of our job now is to make sure that the people who are doing these terrible things get added to these sanctions lists. And the other thing which is really important is I spent the last 2.5 years, almost 3 years, working nearly full time trying to get Vladimir out. And we got him out. We saved his life, but it's sort of a bittersweet success because there's a lot of other people, including some Magnitsky Award winners from the past. There's a man named Alexei who was the very first person who was arrested under the new law saying you can't call a war, who's in terrible shape right now. He's dying in prison, and he's still sitting there. And I think Vladimir and I both feel very strongly that the fight to release other political prisoners is not over by any means. There's a lot of people suffering, and they also need to be released.
And tonight it really is a salutary reminder that the price for standing up for justice can be the ultimate price.
Indeed. One of the things I'm going to do tonight, in addition to honoring the awardees, is I'm going to go through the list of awardees from the past who are no longer with us, who have been murdered or are in jail right now. Because many people who take on these brave projects to try to stand up to dictators find themselves in the worst possible outcome, and we need to remember them and we need to honor them.
Bill, I better let you go and meet your guest this evening. I know you two will have a chance to catch up some more a little later. If I can keep Vladimir a little bit longer,
he's
that
all
would
yours.
be great. Thank you, Bill.
He's a true hero.
Thanks so much.
I'll see you out there in a few minutes. Thank you.
How do you see right now the situation with the war in Ukraine, and how much support is there inside Russia itself for it?
That is an impossible question to ask about an authoritarian, repressive dictatorship where people are imprisoned for expressing their opinion. About a month ago, a man named Yuri Kakhovets in Moscow received a 5-year prison sentence for responding to an opinion poll question saying that he's against the war in Ukraine. 5 years in prison for responding to an opinion poll. And so every time when I hear, when I speak before Western audiences and somebody invariably asks, but why do opinion polls show such high support for Putin for the war? I don't quite know if the person asking that question is serious or not. What opinion polls in a dictatorship? Actually, Russian pollsters say that the average response rate to polls in Russia today are between 5 and 7%. So more than 90% of people refuse to say, and for very good reasons. It is impossible to judge the true state of public opinion in a country that imprisons you for expressing it. What we do have, however, are what I would call glimpses into how a lot of people in Russia actually feel about Putin and about this war. And one such glimpse came in February of this year, when amid the staged circus and the complete unanimity of our so-called presidential election, there was one candidate, a lawyer and a former member of parliament named Boris Nadezhdin, who announced that he was running for president of Russia on an anti-war ticket, saying that he was against the war in Ukraine and he would end it on day one. And the public response was unimaginable. Suddenly, all over Russia, in large cities and small towns, there were these long lines of people who formed at his campaign headquarters, of people who wanted to sign the nominating papers to get him on the ballot. And you can rig election results, you can fake opinion poll numbers, but you cannot rig the images of thousands and thousands of people standing in lines to support an anti-war candidate. And it was so important for people to see that they were not alone, because the Putin propaganda machine tries to pretend that, Russian society is a monolith, right? That all Russians support this war, that all Russians support this regime. And this is a lie, needless to say. And people sort of know it's a lie, but it's very important to see this visibly, as everybody did with those lines from Nadezhdin. Now, of course, needless to say, he was not allowed on the ballot, because opposition candidates in Putin's Russia never are. But that was almost besides the point. I'll never forget one letter I received from a young woman in the town of Novorossiysk, which is on the Black Sea coast in the south of Russia. She was describing how she stood, for several hours in that long line of like-minded, mostly young people, waiting to sign the nominating papers for the anti-war candidate. And then she ended that letter by saying, "I never realized how many of us there are." And I think it's those small glimpses of the reality that show us what people in Russia actually feel about Putin and his criminal war.
And gives you hope, I guess, too.
Absolutely. And what also gives me not only hope, but confidence is my background as a historian, because we know that the future belongs to democracies. The future does not belong to corrupt dictatorial regimes such as the regime of Vladimir Putin. And nobody has ever been able to stop the course of history, and Putin won't be able to either.
And Vladimir, what are your ambitions now for you and for Russia?
My ambition is the same it has been for the past 25 years since I've been involved in the Russian pro-democracy movement. I want Russia to become a normal, modern, democratic European country, a country that would respect both the rights and freedoms of its own citizens and the civilized norms of international behavior. I have absolutely no doubt that they will come, because there are no peoples, there are no nations on the face of this earth that are, quote-unquote, unfit for democracy. I mean, that old determinist view has been debunked and discredited a long time ago. Russia has everything it takes to become a normal democratic country. We have many good people, as in any other country, many cultural, intelligent people. We have a very rich history, which has included a history of political freedom, not as long as I'd wish, but we had those periods both at the beginning and the end of the 20th century. And so my ambition remains the same today as it was when I first came to work with Boris Nemtsov in November of 1999, so exactly 25 years ago, so that Russia becomes a normal, modern, democratic European country that would respect the rights and freedoms of its own citizens and that would abide by the civilized norms of international behavior. I have absolutely no doubt that that day will come. And everything that I do alongside my colleagues in the Russian democratic movement has as its goal to try to bring that day a little closer.
And how do you think the new administration in the US will help you or hinder you or affect that ambition of yours? And also, how do you think it'll affect US policy towards Ukraine and relations with Vladimir Putin?
Well, of course, I don't have any inside information. I'm an observer just like everyone else. What's very important to state is that, change in Russia can only come from inside. It's not going to be brought by anybody, by any American president or any other foreign leader, or, it's not going to be brought down from Mars. Only Russian citizens in Russia can change the situation in our country, and I have no doubt that this will happen. But the important role of the international community, including, governments on both sides of the Atlantic, is to find a way, even now, while the Putin regime remains in power, to maintain a dialogue, to maintain communications with Russian citizens inside Russia who have a different vision for the future of our country, who want Russia to be a normal, peaceful, democratic nation. And what's also very important is for the international community to prepare, to be laying down the roadmaps for that future post-Putin democratic transition. Because what we do know from the modern history of Russia, and I'm a historian by background and by education, is that major political changes in Russia happen like this, at the snap of a finger, suddenly, swiftly, unexpectedly. Both the Tsarist regime at the beginning of the 20th century and the communist regime at the end of the 20th century went down in 3 days, literally speaking, and nobody was prepared. And that's why so many mistakes were made. We cannot afford to repeat those mistakes. And so the next time there is a window of opportunity for democratic change that opens in Russia, we have to be ready to seize it.
You went back to Russia when you were arrested because you believed strongly that change had to come from within Russia itself. And lots of your friends said, don't do it. You know the risks you're running. How do you feel now about making change from not being in Russia? Is it possible to do so? Or do you intend to go back?
Well, first of all, let's not forget that I'm out of Russia involuntarily. Nobody asked my consent even once. I was just, taken in handcuffs from my prison cell first.
So you'd still be there, would you, if you could be?
Well, of course I want to be. I don't want to be in
prison,
prison.
Obviously.
I don't want to be in prison.
But if you were a free man, you would still have stayed there.
Well, of course, Russia's my home. I'm a Russian politician. I think it's natural for every person to want to stay in a home country, isn't it?
No, I know. I just mean irrespective of the risks that you'd be running if you were able to stay.
No, but for now, I find myself just like my colleagues, like Ilya Yashin and others, who actually objected vehemently that he did not want to be exchanged, but nobody asked him. We were just all herded up on the plane and sent out to Turkey because Putin really wanted his hitman from the German prison.
But you're happy to be free, right?
I'm very happy to be free, but I'm not happy to be outside of Russia. And so I think there are many things that can be done regardless of where we are today. One of those things is to do exactly the kind of preparation that we were just talking about with you, because that is something that occupies my mind constantly, because I've written extensively about the mistakes that were committed in the 90s, both by President Yeltsin's team in Russia, but also by the international community, because the chance for a successful transition to democracy was missed by both sides in the 1990s, and we cannot afford to repeat those mistakes again. That's something we can be preparing for now in connection with the international situation, but also something that is much more urgent and something that is an absolute priority for me, something that Bill Browder also touched upon. We have a record number of political prisoners in Russia today. We have more political prisoners in Russia alone today than there were in the whole of the Soviet Union. So that's 15 countries put together in the mid-1980s. And for so many of these people, it is not only a question of unjust and politically motivated imprisonment, although that in itself would be unacceptable, but it is literally a question of life or death, as it is for Alexei, a Moscow municipal councillor who was the first person to have been arrested for his public opposition to the war in Ukraine. As I mentioned, the prisoner exchange that freed us was the first exchange of this kind in nearly 4 decades that liberated Russian political prisoners. We cannot afford to wait another 4 decades. We cannot afford to wait even a year or two, because many of these political prisoners don't have that. And I think one of the most urgent tasks for us today is to continue this campaign, to continue this advocacy, to make sure that the international community, the Western world, intervenes in this crisis regarding politically motivated imprisonment in Russia, intervenes to save the lives of these people whose only quote-unquote crime consists in peacefully objecting to this dictatorial regime that we have in Russia and to the criminal war of aggression that it is leading against Ukraine.
When you were imprisoned for 2.5 years, you got to speak to your children only twice, and that time was very limited when you were able to do so. What do they understand about your story, and what do you tell them?
Well, unfortunately, our children had to grow up really early. That does happen to families of political opponents of authoritarian regimes. My younger daughter's godfather was Boris Nemtsov, the Russian opposition leader who was murdered on Putin's orders in February of 2015. I was poisoned for the first time in May of 2015, the second time in February 2017. Our kids have grown up with this, unfortunately. And so have many families of people who stand up against Putin's regime. I'm very grateful to have the support of my family in what I do, the support of my wife above all, my wife Evgenia, who's been absolutely amazing during the time that I was in prison. And she campaigned relentlessly, not only on my behalf, but on behalf of all political prisoners in Russia, and she continues to do so now. And I'm very grateful to have the support and understanding and solidarity of my family, of my children. And I think that is something that is very, very important in this situation, to have the support of your loved ones, to have this support system that allows you to continue doing what you feel is the right thing.
And finally, this evening at the awards ceremony, it is a moment, I suppose, for reflection for someone like yourself. What will be going through your mind?
Well, of course, this month marks the 15th anniversary of the murder of Sergei Magnitsky in a Russian prison. This is the 10th awards ceremony. And I think it's a moment to pause and to recognize all these amazing, outstanding people, not just in Russia, but all over the world, because this award has a global significance, a global reach now. To remember and to stand in solidarity for all of those people around the world who have the courage, the tenacity, and the perseverance to stand up to these rogue dictatorships, to these authoritarian regimes, very often at great personal cost. Because at the end of the day, it is people like that who drive history forward.
It's been really a pleasure and a privilege to meet you. Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful to be in your program. Thank you so much.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio at the Magnitsky Awards in London. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can sign up for membership on the link below to be the first to get exclusive access. You can also listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and also to Laura Martinez-Williams, and to you for watching. Bye for now.